good morning. I'm Jeff Coleman.
And I'm Deborah Pinkerton. Welcome to Morning Light.
In just a moment, our Morning Light panel will go behind the headlines.
But first, here's a preview of what's coming up later in the show. 18 years ago today, a milk truck driver walked into the West Nickel Mines Amish school in Lancaster County, opening fire. 5 female students were killed, 5 others wounded, and he eventually took his own life. You will meet the woman who was married to that man. She will share the very tough road to hope, faith, and forgiveness.
An extraordinary story. Well, we begin this morning in the aftermath of Iran's missile strikes against Israel on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. It comes just days before the first anniversary of the devastating October 7th terrorist attacks.
But with the help of U.S. military forces, along with David Sling and the Arrow missile defense systems, the Israeli Defense Forces reports most of the 181 missiles were intercepted.
So as we struggle to keep pace with the minute-by-minute changes in the Middle East, last night Israeli citizens received an all-too-familiar text message warning them to head to shelter. David Pfeiffer is a businessman in Rehovot, Israel, with deep roots in Pennsylvania. This morning he joins us outside the door to his family's bomb shelter. David, what a privilege to have you on Morning Light.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here.
David, if you would, I know that you're, first I'll apologize to our viewers that you might have to leave if the air raid siren goes off, and we'll certainly excuse you for that. But take us back to yesterday. This is a familiar alert for families in Israel, a part of daily life. Walk us through what exactly happens.
Well, I mean, it depends what time of the day it is. If it's during the day, generally, I mean, wherever you are, you have to stop and react. If you're in your car, which is probably the worst place to be, you have to get out and lay down on the road or on the sidewalk and cover your head. Not that that's going to give you much shelter. If it happens in the middle of the night, I've told people this story before, we go to bed with our clothes and our shoes right next to the bed so that if there's a siren, we can grab our clothing and shoes and dash to the bomb shelter and put our clothes on there, because if by terrible chance the bomb hits your shelter, hits nearby, there's going to be plenty of dust, glass, and concrete, and you're not going to be able to get out without getting hurt. So you need your clothes and you need your shoes close by all the time.
So, David, you're 20 minutes outside of Tel Aviv, south of Tel Aviv. What does that mean for you? What sounds do you hear? How does your family react? You've got 2 children, your wife inside of your shelter. What are these moments like?
They're difficult. I mean, it feels like being mugged, actually. And not that I've been mugged, but I imagine that that's what a person feels when you're attacked and you're trying to come to grips with why somebody is trying to kill you. Why is somebody trying to do this to you? It's a difficult feeling to come to grips with. And how we get through it is we try to make light of it. And it's much harder on our children than it is us. We've sat and recited Psalms, particularly Psalm 23. And last night, my wife added something more to the mix. As we're sitting there listening to the explosions outside, my wife takes the cornflakes box out and says, it's time to have cornflakes. So she poured everybody a cup of cornflakes. I sent you a picture of it, by the way, and put it in a plastic cup, and everybody had cornflakes while the booms are going on. You just have to make light of it. And the secret really is a person of faith. If you really, really believe, you'll never be afraid. And that's really the key. And you can look at Psalm 23 and understand that. But I say to you, it's what gets Israel through. It's what gets us through here. If you don't believe, you're going to be terrified. But if you have a faith and you believe in God, you have nothing to fear whatsoever.
Well, David, your faith is coming through loud and clear this morning. Look, we're nearing the October 7th anniversary, and it's been a perpetual, constant state of alerts from the U.S. State Department, from the IDF, from all of the foreign agencies coming in and out of Israel. What is your sense of optimism today? Does this last wave of exchanges now between Iran, between Hezbollah, does this make you more optimistic about where you're headed? Do you see an end to this? Where's your hope today?
Well, my hope is in God's promise to Israel. And I think if we all remember that, if your listeners remember God's promise to Israel, none of us have anything to fear. Actually, we have a lot of hope for the future. because the greatest and most prolific thing that's happened in 2,000 years was in 1948 when the state of Israel was organized. I mean, who could have imagined that after 2,000 years the Jews would return to Zion? Who could imagine that? That in itself is a bona fide sign from above that something great is happening. And I think that that's what carries us through. We realize that, and we know that something special is going on. That's what brought me here. I wanted to be a part of this. This is an incredible movement to be part of the rebuilding of the state. It means great things for the future. What the politicians are going to do, I don't know. I mean, my faith is in God. It's not in this politician or that politician or that party or that party. I think ultimately what will happen is God's plan will be revealed, and it will be according to Scripture. And we should all feel very, very confident and never lose sight of our faith in that.
David, I know you've encouraged so many people this morning, and I can't smell it through the camera, but I know that your family is preparing for Rosh Hashanah tonight. We're, an hour or so away from sundown. Thank you for being a light today and for sharing with all of your friends back in Pennsylvania your extraordinary journey, and Shana Tova to you.
Shana Tova, and thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Well, in just a minute, we're going to welcome our Morning Light panel. Back this morning, we're delighted to have Pastor David Smith. We're so thankful to have Representative Clint Owlett, Luke Covert. All of you have added an extraordinary perspective this week. You're seeing these images. You heard from David this morning, certainly coming hours before the presidential debate. For people who are thinking, the world is coming unglued. This is the worst possible of all events. Where do you you echo the hope? He quotes Psalm 23. Are you echoing that hope, Clint?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have to check our minds too. We automatically want to go to this is the end of the world and this is really bad. And in bad situations, you have to control that a little bit. Don't go there if that's not where the Lord is leading. You know what I mean? So yeah. I think finding really hope from God's word, being grounded in your faith, being, rooted in his word doesn't allow you to go to places that you shouldn't go in your mind. So I think that's what's, you heard it from him there, being grounded in your faith and in the word is so, so important.
Pastor David, it doesn't always come in the form of a missile attack. It can come as a diagnosis, a call from a relative, a breakup. Where do you point people in situations like that who are saying, hey, my son isn't going to make it if something doesn't get interrupted here?
Well, I think we've clearly got to have, as Christians, an understanding of the sovereignty of God. Ephesians 1:11, Isaiah 46:11 talks about that the counsel of the Lord is unchangeable. Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 3.1, talks about that God freely and unchangeably ordains all things that are going to happen. Those missiles, man, what riveting images that we saw. None of those took him by surprise. None of the missiles that hit our lives takes God by surprise, and he is there. Jesus says in Matthew 28, lo, I am with you, even to the end of the age. He is right there with us through it all. Romans tells us he's working it out for our good. It doesn't say it is good, but he's working it out for our good, so we can trust him through it all. It's not easy. Yeah. It is very, very difficult.
Luke, when you're tucking your kids in at night, what do you tell them about these events? Do you just say, turn it all off, honey, we're not going to tell the kids about this? Don't watch the debate, don't watch the attacks on Israel? Yeah. What do you do?
I'm glad I'm actually not the director of this thing, because there's some relief in knowing that God's in charge, of my family more than I can be, of my life more than I can be, and knowing that he's better at this than I am, and that even though I don't understand, I don't have that zoomed out thing, I haven't read the final page of the script yet, and so, even though it doesn't make sense in the middle, it's an amazing story, and so I try and tell my kids that type of thing. Like, we don't know where this is headed quite yet, but man, we're in the middle of something amazing and horrible and wonderful. And remember we had ice cream and there's missiles raining down across the world. Yeah. That's that the paradox there is, I think, common in Christian life.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it's beautiful and terrible and terrifying and awesome.
I think it would be very interesting to have a dad who's a filmmaker who can help connect those dots. That's a beautiful picture. Yeah. The debate last night, quick takeaways. A lot of people were expecting a food fight. What they seemed to get was two adults talking. Clint?
Yeah, it really was. I think they watched our show where we were talking about what we wanted to see.
I think they did.
We did. We saw that. We saw policy. We saw a sense of humility, which, where they actually were agreeing on some things.
You go first. I agree with
right,
you.
Yeah,
Right.
it was very interesting. We saw authenticity. I think that was one thing that our generation is actively looking for. I think we saw pieces of that last night where people were off their rehearsed responses that they were looking for. So that was encouraging to see. I think that it was a breath of fresh air in this race.
Luke?
Yeah. I think the contrast was immediately apparent that there's hope for the future. That was my thought. Oh my goodness, they're talking about real things.
A few more days, right?
A few more
One
days.
more election, maybe.
And the contrast between kind of the first string players of the presidential debate, being just kind of a battle of personality almost, from my perspective. This was it made me realize that's what I'd been watching. And that this was a battle of policies and vision and future of the country. And I still worry that maybe, less people are undecided, or people are more watching it as a UFC fight, hoping that their candidate lands a punch.
Right.
I kind of do worry about that, but personally, I'm encouraged.
30 seconds, David.
Yeah, J.D. Vance, I think the pivotal point for me was when he looked at Governor Walz and said, I really want to pray for you. I'm concerned about your 17-year-old son who was in that shooting. And he said, I'm praying for you, and Christ be with you. We saw the compassion of a Christian man who has great faith, extending that to another person who was his quote-unquote opponent. And I think, Jeff, that's what we've talked about, you've talked about since you've been doing Morning Light, that we can show and display that compassion towards one another. Even though we disagree about some fundamental and pretty important issues, we can still exercise 1 Corinthians 13, love conquers all things. And he displayed that in a very, very great way.
It's a scripture that's not just for weddings.
Absolutely.
So, gentlemen, thank you all very much. We're going to lose you because you're heading back up to Tioga County to take care of some business, and
work to do.
We'll find a replacement for you tomorrow. But
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks to our Morning Light panel for just an extraordinary conversation this morning. Coming up on Morning Light, her husband opened fire inside the West Nickel Mine one-room schoolhouse in 2006, but in the years since, it has caused her to lean deeper into her relationship with Christ. Marie Monville is here to share her amazing story of faith and forgiveness. That's next.
October 2nd, 2006, 18 years ago, a day that shattered a Lancaster County community and changed it forever. At 10:25 in the morning, Lancaster County native Charles Roberts entered the West Nickel Mines Amish school and barricaded the door. Roberts allowed women with infants and boys to leave the school, leaving behind 10 girls ranging in age from 6 to 13. Just after 11, Roberts fired more than a dozen shots before killing himself. 5 girls died and the others were injured. Within an hour of the shootings, the unthinkable happened. Reports indicate some men in the Amish community warned young relatives not to hate the killer, saying he had a mother, a wife, and a soul, and now he's standing before a just God. In the days ahead, the Amish community wrapped their arms around Marie, the widow of the shooter, and her family, and they established a charitable fund for them. Forgiveness, a 3-syllable word that carries the strength to tear down walls and build new ones. And this day started like many others. Charlie Roberts had some errands to run. His wife Marie was attending a prayer group. But then she got the call that would not only change her life, but many others. It would make national headlines. Joining me right now is Marie Monville. Thank you for being with us.
It's a privilege to be here.
18 years ago today. Tell us about this journey.
You know, for me, that day started like any other. We walked the kids to the bus stop that morning and gave them a kiss. I never thought that would be the last time they saw their dad. I went to the prayer group. When I came home, I was expecting Charlie to be there, but instead he called. And I could tell by the sound of his voice something was wrong. He said, "I'm not coming home." His voice was flat and cold and lifeless, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. And as he's talking to me, saying things that didn't make sense, it was as if I could see my whole life flash before my eyes. I knew I wouldn't see him again. And at the end of the call, he was talking about, what he was going to do, but not saying specifics. And I was saying to him, please don't do whatever it is that you're planning. There has to be another way. There's always another way. But he wasn't listening to me. When I hung up that call, I was concerned he had planned to harm himself, but I had no idea that he intended to hurt anyone else. I called 911 thinking maybe something that didn't make sense to me would make sense to them. But I could tell that the dispatcher knew far more than I did, and he wasn't telling me anything. At the end of the call, he simply said, "Please stay by the phone. If we need you, we'll call you back." It wasn't long after that call until the police were in my driveway. I met them at the door and I said, "It's Charlie, isn't it?" And they said yes. And I said, "And he's dead, isn't he?" And they said yes. They came in and told me about the events of that schoolhouse that morning. And to think that this man that had so loved his kids was possibly capable of doing what he had done, it just didn't make sense to me. But there was no way to deny it because it was staring me in the face.
How did you get through this?
I had asked Jesus in my heart when I was 5 and had lived out my journey with him. And this wasn't the first difficult place that I had walked. And I had learned through my life that I could trust God. And while I knew this circumstance seemed big to me, I knew that God doesn't see it that way. Things aren't hard and easy for him. He just is present and he's real. And I made a choice that day to believe that God is everything he says he is, and that somehow he would come right where I was and walk with me, the Amish community, and the many others that were impacted by this.
Talk to me about your children. How did you tell them about this?
I knew that my kids, being 7, 5, and a year and a half, they needed to know the truth, but they needed it in bite-sized pieces. And so that day I simply said, "Today your dad made some very bad choices. Some people got hurt and some people died, and he died too." And that was enough for that moment. I knew that I had to unpack the truth of it over the days ahead. They needed to know the truth before they went back to school. I couldn't risk them hearing something on the playground or on the school bus and thinking there was no way that it could possibly be true, and only to find out later that it was.
You told me about something that happened with your father and the Amish. Share that.
I was in my parents' kitchen that afternoon looking out the window and thinking, how does life change in an instant? And I saw some Amish men walking down the street. This was the town that I grew up in. We all knew each other. They weren't strangers to me. And so I knew they were coming to my parents' home. I went to my mom and dad and said, "What do I do?" My dad said, "It's okay, Marie. I'll go out and talk with them." And so I watched from the window. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw everything. I saw the tears that flowed down all of their faces, the way they put their hands on my dad's shoulder, and the way they embraced before they all walked away. And when he came inside, we waited for him to collect himself from the emotion of that moment. And he said, "Marie, they came because they were concerned about you. They wanted you to know that they had forgiven Charlie and they were extending grace and compassion over your family."
How did that make you feel?
I think it's easy to think that forgiveness is just this thing that happens when we realize that we've hurt someone and we want to make amends for it. But their choice to forgive Charlie, my choice to forgive Charlie, it wasn't about Charlie. It was about opening our hearts and allowing God to do something that only he could do. When I look back at this journey of my life, I know that it was significantly impacted by their willingness to tell me about the forgiveness that had already existed inside of them and the way that they were living that out.
How have you used this tragedy as a positive way to impact others?
I think we all go through hard things. It's easy in the moment to think that we're the only one, but the reality is we all face difficult circumstances. And for me, there's hope in sharing my story, the hope that I'm able to share with other people so that they too can believe in more than just their circumstances, more than they know right now. And so I do that through coaching, speaking, and through books that I've written.
Tell us about your children. How are they doing now? It's been 18 years.
Yeah, just as it's been a journey for me, it's been a journey for them. And I think the reality is that as our kids grow up, they see things and they process them through different lenses. And so it's not just this thing that happened 18 years ago, but in many ways, the story is still being written. They're still going through aspects of that. But it's not just the bad, it's also the good of saying, okay, this is who God has been in my life, and I can trust who God is in their lives too.
Okay, Marie, thank you. Stay with us. Right, we'll come back to you right after the break, and you will talk to us about how God is using you to help others through these very difficult times. And the Nickel Mines Amish community has used their faith to help them move forward. 10 days after the shooting, they tore down the schoolhouse and built a new one at a new location. And very sorry to report, just last month, one of the surviving students died from complications from the shooting. Stay with us. We'll be right back. A local woman has turned tragedy into triumph. She is now helping others break free from feelings of confusion and self-doubt. Joining me now once again is Marie Monville. You had mentioned earlier about how you are turning something so tragic into something so positive. Talk to us about the books you've written.
Yeah, so in 2013, I partnered with Zondervan to write my first book, One Light Still Shines, which really gives you the journey of my life, not just what happened at the Amish schoolhouse that day, but how God has been present throughout all of my life. And then last year, I wrote a book called To Help You Heal, which is really this place of saying, we all have our struggles. Sometimes we struggle with self-criticism, negative self-talk, the courage to dream after our lives have had these places of devastation, learning to trust God. We all need to work on that. And so it really is the practical application of saying, okay, this is how I get through, sharing stories from my life journey, not just related to that time in 2006, but since, and then turning that around to give people the opportunity to apply those truths to their life. And then just a few months ago, I released my third book called Rooted. It's a guided devotional journal for couples.
Wow. And what type of message do you hope you are getting across to people reading any one of these books?
The truth is we all go through hard things, but we have the power to choose. We have the power to choose how we want to write our stories. And honestly, when God is in it, and He always is, there isn't anything that He can't overcome. And that's the message. We don't have to love our circumstance. We just have to get up every day and being willing to choose to trust God and allow Him to do more than we could ask, think, or imagine.
Yeah, I love that line. We can write our own story through God's help. Talk to us about also being a motivational speaker.
Yeah, for me, it's this place where I can connect with other people, connect to their pain and brokenness. They hear me talk about my life and they can identify, even though their circumstances are different, they can identify with things that I've said and find their own takeaways to be able to apply that truth and have that same hope for their stories.
And what type of impact do you see when you go out and speak to people? What is the reaction you're getting?
People will come up to me afterwards and say, hey, my life isn't like yours, but, and I always say, pain is not a competition. There's no comparison here. And so it's this place of authenticity. People want to connect from that place of saying, this is an authentic way to live out faith, to be honest about our struggles, but then also to look beyond them to say, where is God right now in my life? How do I put my mind in a place where I can see the good and not just focus on the bad, because that makes the difference. So I think it's both the practical application of how they can take bits and pieces of my story and infuse it into their stories, also partnered with the reality that God is everything He says He is. The Bible is alive and breathing, and it lives and breathes inside of each one of us.
And you seem like you're doing well today.
Yes, I can honestly say I love my life. No, I don't love all the circumstances, but I love what God has done with it. I love the person that I've become and the life I get to live.
And thank you so much for sharing your journey with us and giving us inspiration that if we trust in God, we can look beyond, we can look to the future.
Absolutely, it's a privilege to share with you.
And stay with us, we will be right back. Coming up tomorrow on Morning Light, changing the lives of young people by introducing them to Christ. The executive director of True Life Youth Ministries will share how the program equips youth to become spiritual leaders in their schools, families, and communities. Plus, you will hear from someone who has been impacted by this ministry. Now, that's a look at what's coming up tomorrow on Morning Light. Now, Jeff, your closing thoughts, and we want to continue to pray for all of those in the Middle East and certainly pray for peace.
And we'll be praying certainly for David Pfieffer and his family. We're so honored to have them on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. Well, last night's vice presidential debate was good for the soul, wasn't it? Two men who disagree on a lot of things, speaking to each other with kindness, civility, and some old-fashioned courtesy. There were really big differences. You could hear that. But they listened to each other, and they disagreed without a single incident of name-calling or the usual insults we become used to in political debates. Pretty refreshing stuff. But if you're someone who calls yourself a Christian, that's a follower of Jesus, remembering the person in front of you is made in the image of God is at the heart of who we are. It's not actually an option. Treating someone with dignity, with respect, with common courtesy is the minimum. He calls us to love our enemies and pray for their good. You heard that all throughout this program today. What a freeing way to live. For Deborah and the entire Morning Light team, I'm Jeff Coleman. Thanks for watching today, and God willing, we'll see you again tomorrow.